Welcome, everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz from the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and very happy to be here today talking about these two chapters from her book, Origins of Totalitarianism, um, Race Thinking Before Racism, and Race and Bureaucracy, chapters 6 and 7 of the Origins. It's no secret that these two chapters are about race. It's in the title, and it's throughout the chapters. Anytime we talk about race today, these are difficult conversations, and we're going to try and do it as clearly and honestly as we can. I just ask everybody to be as honest and clear as they can, and try and take people for what they're saying. Her work on race is important. It's important in this book, and it's important in her entire thinking. And it's also on it. You can't read these two chapters on race without also thinking about her discussion of race in the anti-Semitism section of the book, which we've already read. I might as well start with the conversation that Bob and Jack were just having. I was listening in. I hope that's okay. There are many criticisms of Arendt along the lines of race in a number of books that she wrote, including this one. And Bob was pointing out to some of those areas where those criticisms happen. And I think it's important for us to address them head on. Again, the effort here is not to be defensive in defending Arendt, but to try and understand her and see if what she's saying is important for her argument and if it makes any sense. So there are a number of controversial statements in these chapters that we might want to just get out there, and I'm happy to have people bring out more. The first one is that in the chapter 6, Race Thinking Before Racism, she makes an argument that today would be considered very difficult to make, which is that there's a difference between race thinking and racism. And she wants to say that racism is an ideology, and race thinking is part of the history of opinions. And while a lot of race thinking is mean and prejudiced, and the kind of thinking that is wrong, as she says, Tocqueville writes to Gobineau at one point, it is simply an opinion, and as an opinion is not dangerous in the same way that racism is. That doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact, doesn't mean it's not important, but she does want to say it is an opinion. And as some of you know who know her other works, that goes a long way in Arendt's thinking, because for her, politics is about opinions. There's no truths. And so once you're in the realm of politics, any opinion is a legitimate opinion. It can be wrong, and people can disagree with it, and we can try and persuade people that this opinion is one they should hold or they should give up. But it is not in itself wrong. It is not untrue. It's an opinion, and it needs to be dealt with by persuasion. And so, if you take Arendt's thinking in chapter 6 seriously about race thinking, it raises real questions for the way we think about and talk about race in our time, which is to say that there is a strong belief among many who call themselves or see themselves as anti-racists, and I think most of us on this line, I hope, in some way fit that category, that to think in racial terms is suspect, and that all racial prejudices are suspect and wrong, and that we should do away with prejudices, and we should do away with opinions based on race. And Arendt will argue in other works that that's simply impossible, that all human thinking includes prejudices, which are simply prejudgments, and that on the one hand, the work of politics um, uh, is to attack and change those prejudgments which are nefarious and wrong. On the other hand, we could never get rid of all prejudgments, and prejudgments are what allow us to go through life without having to be paralyzed in trying to understand every situation and every new person we meet. And so prejudices are part of human life for her. And not now race, the fact that we have racial prejudices are fairly new. She thinks it began around the 18th century. But the point is that she has a willingness to take seriously the race thinking, race opinions that bothers a lot of people. A lot of these people that she talks about, Boulanger, Gobineau, are people who are considered racists today, and taught, if they're taught at all, and they're almost never taught, only taught as examples of the history of racism. And Arendt is saying they weren't racists, they were race thinkers, and we need to understand them, and we need to understand the difference. In the second chapter, Race and Bureaucracy, she argues that both racism and bureaucracy, the two driving forces of imperialism, were found in Africa. And she says, for one thing, that Africa is the dark continent, right? Which has led to people claiming that that's a racist statement. And I'm not going to argue it is or isn't. I don't think it is, but it might be. But we have to understand what she means by dark here. She means, in the way that Bob and Jack were talking about a little while ago, the one that had least entered into European civilization and history. Now, is that correct? That's an interesting question. Certainly in Northern Africa, there was a much longer tradition of entering into European society. But she sees Africa as being a place that, for most Europeans, was dark, not in the sense that people in there had dark skin, but in the sense that it was unknown and had not yet entered into the Western civilization project. She then spends a lot of time talking about the encounter of the Boers, between the Boers and the African tribes. And her claim here is that the Boers encountered the African tribes as someone who, as beings who were both familiar in being human and yet radically unfamiliar and radically alien. Now, the argument she makes, and one that we have to decide if we want to credit, right? And I mean that honestly, because I think it is a decision you have to make, is that the alienness of the Boers, what made them alien, was not their color or their skin. She says it was their nearness to nature. It was the fact that they lived in a very sparse, bare way, without the civilizational aspects that people from Europe had been used to, and that thus they were close to nature and seemed like that. And the Boers recoiled, she says, at the nearness and distance that they felt to these people that they encountered, and they reacted by saying, "We must not be of the same race as them," and then thinking that they are gods, and that the Boers came to think of themselves as gods. Now, the irony of the Boers situation for Arendt is that the Boers then, as gods who had the natives, who enslaved the natives and had them do work for them, became like the natives. They ceased to work, and they retreated away from cities and became and lived on the veldt, in the wilderness, and came to be very much like natural people. They lost their Europeanness from Arendt's point of view. And by the end of the encounter between the Boers and the African natives, Arendt thinks that the Boers had become as uncivilized and as outside of history and as close to nature as had the Africans. And she's as contemptuous and critical of the Boers as she is of the African tribes. That's how that's a bit of what's going on, and we can imagine and we can understand, I think, why people find this problematic. There's a kind of cultural looking down upon people who live like what she would call savages, brutes, whether that's the Africans or whether it's the Boers. And it's a kind of prejudice in favor of those who work and are civilized. And let's just admit that it's a prejudice, but let's also say that it's part of Arendt's well thought out and deeply held view of what human beings are. So in her book, The Human Condition, and also later in this book, around page 299 at the end to 300 at the end of the chapter on imperialism, Arendt develops an understanding of humans, of humanity, as people who are both natural people and thus subject to nature and to fate, but also are artificers, people who make the world they live in. And for her, that tension between being both a natural, fated person who does not control their fate and who lives in a world on Earth that they didn't make or control, and their ability to remake the world and their environment, and that tension between those two things is at the very heart of what it means to be human. And so for and in The Human Condition and in some of her later works, she is worried that with the rise of technology and the rise of what today is called transhumanism, the idea that humans could actually build artificial worlds, spaceships or new planets that they would live in where everything on the planet was artificial, those humans would in a way lose part of their humanity because they would lose the natural side of their humanity and would become people who live purely artificial lives, especially once we start cloning and genetically modifying humans, which she thinks is going to happen and thinks will deeply disconnect humans from their natural sides, animal sides. Whereas the others, she also thinks that that to live a purely natural life that doesn't seek to overcome one's natural creations and create a human world is to live like an animal. And so she has that prejudice. It's one she is aware of and one she believes makes sense. So what I'm trying to suggest, and I'm happy to hear people who disagree, is that there's no doubt prejudice at work in these pages. Whether it's racial prejudice or not, I think is an open question, and one that I actually think is less true. But that doesn't mean she didn't also have racial prejudices, and I think she would have similar views. Well, she does express similar views about the Boers as she does the black natives, and she would have similar views about other what she would call savage peoples. Now, we don't use the word savage anymore. We don't. It's considered not only not a good word, but it's considered wrong because, and I think this is what Bob Meyerson was referring to, the rise of anthropology and studies of native peoples or pre-industrial peoples or around the world has shown us that they have a much richer historical and cultural and artistic life than I think most people knew or believed, and that research has certainly impacted our understanding of how to address and think about tribal and native peoples. Does that impact Arendt's analysis? It's an interesting question. What she the core of her analysis in chapter 6 on or chapter 7 on the Boers and the African natives is that the word race and the idea of racism emerged in this interaction between the Boers and the Africans, and that this was the first true experience of racism in the modern world, and that if we look at it, we can try and understand what racism is and what distinguishes it from race thinking. And the key in doing that is this understanding of the just utter fear and response to the unknown and fear of the alien that the Boers, she says, experienced when they encountered the African natives. And what really scared the Boers, or threw the Boers, she says, and this is on page 190 to 191, is that what really shocked them is that these people were human. And because they were human, and because they seemed so foreign and so inhuman to them, the Boers had to create an ideology which said that the Boers were gods and these other people were like animals. And this, she says, is what true racism is. And it is an ideology of supremacy and inferiority. And it is the kind of ideology that she thinks reappeared in Europe in the 1920s and 30s that justified Nazism. And it's the kind of ideology that reappeared in the United States and elsewhere in the late 19th century that began to justify slavery not as a temporary and unjust phenomena, but as a permanent and justified activity. So this is really, there's a lot to be done on this research-wise. There needs to be more written on Arendt and race. And I think she has some fascinatingly innovative and speculative thoughts, but there's no doubt that they're thoughts by a somewhat elitist Jewish, German, European woman of the 1950s. And let me just stop there, and maybe some people have some comments, thoughts, responses to what I've said so far.
Roger, can you hear me?
Yes, I do, Patrick.
I guess I'm sorry I missed the early conversation that took place, but out of these, actually the last 3 chapters, I took the idea that she was trying to demonstrate how imperialism was a stepstone to totalitarianism, and giving historical examples of how one group of people, happen to be Europeans, English, German, Belgium, whatever, could begin to think of other groups of people that had been conquered or bought or colonialized in some way were non-human, that they actually, and whether you called it race, a different race, a lesser than the European race. That's what I took out of all of it. Now, I understand, I didn't think she wanted it to be a specific, exact, accurate history lesson, but to give the tenure of what was going on in people's minds in that, middle of, 18th, she keeps referring to 17th, how it developed from 17th, 18th century and so on. But that's what I took out of it. The most important thing that she was trying to point out is how did one group of people who were civilized, the Western Europeans, began to look at other groups of people as being non-human. And that was on the way to, again, from imperialism to totalitarianism. That's how I took it. Not a history lesson, in fact, but just kind of a touching on history to give examples of how it developed.
I think that is the way it's meant, Patrick. And so if I didn't on the recording that was sent out on Monday, I didn't spend much time on this question of race in this sense, because it's not going to be that helpful for understanding her argument, which is, as you said, an argument about imperialism. And the argument, is very clear, I hope, although we're going to try and clarify it, that race and bureaucracy are the two driving necessary forces that make imperialism as a kind of non-national, submissive, dominating politics possible. And racism is necessary for that because it justifies the domination and the conquering of other peoples. And so clearly the overarching tenor of this is a deep criticism of the rise of racism and how it fits into the imperialist story. I'm just trying to be responsive to the comments earlier, but also honest with the fact that many people have read these chapters and recoiled at them and thought that her description of A, race thinking, B, Africa, and C, the African natives was racist. Now, part of what's going on is what she's interested in is not actually her view of the African people, but the way the Boers and the Africans reacted to each other, and thus the Boers' view. And she's saying that the Boers reacted to the Africans as if they were non-human, and that Boers were gods. And that is important in the history of imperialism because it shows it was she says, one of the first true experiences where Europeans learned that they could use racism as an excuse and justification for long-term imperialist domination. And so from that point of view, I take your point exactly right. And we could say, look, the details, let's not get into them. And I'm just trying to be honest and attentive to the fact that in this day and age, when many people read this book, that's one of the first reactions they have. I don't want to hide it. Crystal, do you want to ask your question? Crystal? So Crystal asks, how would I describe the Boers in class terms? I'm going to get back to Jack and Suzanne Ouellette's questions. Don't worry. How would I describe the Boers in class terms? Well, I can only tell you what Arendt says, right? Which is that she thinks of them as people who were not part of a class, insofar as they largely became superfluous in the way she often talks about the masses and others. For her, the Boers became part of the great wild jungle. They ceased to work, and they lost their connection to a public world. She says on page 193 that.
Chris, can I?
Hello? They said that nobody, about 6 lines down on 193, no body politic, no communal organization kept the Boers together. No territory was definitely colonized, and the black slaves did not serve any white civilization. The Boers had lost both their peasant relationship to the soil and their civilized feeling for human fellowship. Each man fled the tyranny of his neighbor's smoke was the rule of the country, and each Boer family repeated in complete isolation the general pattern of Boer experience among black savages and ruled over them in absolute lawlessness, unchecked by kind neighbors, etc. So her view of the Boers is that they weren't a member of a class. They're not part of the bourgeoisie. They're not the working class. They're not the elite. They are a group that, in a sense, retreated to the woods and created a lived fantasy in which they were gods who ruled over a brute, savage people and lived a very poor and simple life. That's her view of the Boers. I guess Robert tried to answer that question. I don't know if Robert wants to add to what I've said. Robert, are you there?
Sorry. I didn't know if the commentary runs alongside or if they're questions. So I like your answer very much. Thank you.
Anyone else want to say anything about this, the question of race or race thinking? I mean, we can always come back to it. Bob, did you want to follow up on some of the earlier conversation that you and Jack were having?
No, I'm just listening at this point. Thank you.
Okay.
Could I just make one comment, Roger?
I don't know who said it, but can I...
Roger?
Why don't you go ahead, Patrick?
Okay. As far as the bureaucracy, what I couldn't, what came to my mind after reading the discussion of bureaucracy and how that became where Egypt and South Africa, these people weren't people anymore. They were just objects of the bureaucracy. That made me, I know it's off the subject, but it made me think of our current prison system, where people put into prison and they're no longer human. They don't treat it, for most prisons anyway, they're treated as objects and not people. It's a little off the subject. I apologize, but I couldn't resist it.
I'm not quite
Roger?
sure what happens to. Go ahead. I'm not quite sure what has happened to Roger. If anyone else can see him, stop me. But in the interim, I'm happy to do a little bit of moderation. I'm not sure who was just speaking, but Patrick, I don't think that's really off the topic at all at the end of the day. Because what we're talking about is the creation of a bureaucratic function, right? Before racism, there was bureaucracy. But after the invention of racism, bureaucracy as such, whether or not it's attached to race, has a new function. And that function is the creation and management of surplus peoples, in the same way that in the previous chapter, capital created and managed surplus peoples, right? We have an evolution of a system here. I'm sorry, I know Jack was speaking earlier.
Yeah, and
someone else did. Who wants to talk?
I'd like to come back into that discussion again just for a moment, because the question for me arises then is Arendt viewing the rise of or as she calls it, the discovery of racism and bureaucracy as essential to the development of imperialism, or does she see them as tools that the imperialists were able to use to strengthen imperialism? It's a before and after thing. It's a question about chicken and egg.
Hi, Jack. Can you guys hear me now? I'm sorry, I'm having some internet problems. But this is Roger.
Roger, I can hear you. I don't know about others.
Yeah,
I can
so I don't
hear
have
Roger.
video.
We can hear you.
I don't have video, but at least I'm on. Ian, do you want to answer, Jack? Because I was just trying to I'm still trying to reconnect. I didn't hear the whole thing.
Right, sure. So what I would say, I mean, it's difficult because, of course, imperialism existed before this joint genesis of bureaucracy and racism. So you couldn't quite say that racism and bureaucracy were necessary for imperialism. That couldn't be the origin of the chicken and the egg. On the other hand, I think what she's more interested in is the evolution of the specific kind of imperialism, the kind of imperialism that was oriented towards the domination of other peoples, and peoples understood as races. For that transition to happen, that needed both the concept of race, which is invented amongst the German thinkers in the late 18th century, and it needed bureaucratization that was oriented around the concept of race itself. So in a sense, even if you had imperialism before this joint genesis, there was a kind of co-evolution of the later, more virulent form that gave rise to totalitarianism that required the concept of race and race thinking to translate it into bureaucratized racism. And that's one of the things that I would sort of mention a little bit on what Roger was saying earlier about the distinction between race thinking and racism, which is that I think it's important not to read her later works backward into origins of totalitarianism. What she's telling here is a story specifically about how a set of categories which were very honestly being sort of non-normatively debated, even if they contained, as she says herself, the dangerous seeds of later racism. But both anti-racists and racists were playing around with this scientific idea in what they called scientific racism of, well, what is a race? What constitutes races? And she notes, importantly, that race was originally applied between and towards European peoples. If you look at the early writers on race, Kant among them, I say that because I happen to have read him. When he talks about races, he talks about the German race, the French race, right? So what's necessary for imperialism in the latter form, in the virulent form, is the translation of that sort of dangerous thought experimentation into a bureaucratized ideology. So that's the chicken and egg, in a way, even though the egg happened before the chicken. Roger, you want to take it back over?
I'm happy to.
Can I just add
Yeah, go ahead.
Crystal had something. Dawn had something too. So let's make sure we get to both of them. Crystal?
Hi. Hello? Hello?
Go
Dawn, I
ahead,
can hear
Crystal.
you too.
Go ahead, Crystal.
Or Crystal?
All right. Dawn, do you want to try?
Sure, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to make sure we were drawing a distinction between I think it's a distinction that she's careful to draw between race thinking as, I mean, it's kind of in line with what Ian was saying, as a way of understanding social relations or history, and racism as an ideology. I mean, and when she talks about ideology, she defines it as a key to the understanding of the movement of history, right? And so the sort of systematic understanding of genetic differences between kinds of people as a key to the movement of history, and as a primary justification for political policies or ways of organizing society. I think that's the distinction she's trying to draw. And in thinking about how Arendt herself might be critiqued in this discussion, I think we might want to accuse her more of a kind of a cultural chauvinism that relies more on thinking about institutions and traditions rather than inherent genetic differences between people.
I think that's a fair characterization, Dawn. I mean, if you want to call her a cultural chauvinist, in some sense, I don't think she would. I don't think she would contest that. I certainly wouldn't. But I think, but that's just a kind of prejudice that she has. But I don't think that goes to her argument, right? Which I think you and Ian and I think others have largely accurately prescribed, right? Which is that there is a history going on here, which, yes, imperialism began before racism, as did slavery, but that they could not have taken the kind of violent and oppressive forms that they did without racism, which I think was what Ian was saying, if I understood him correctly, which itself is not yet totalitarianism, right? And that will be the next level. So her what excavation of this idea of racism is important, and what she's saying is as that while there were lots of race thinkings, and yes, Europeans talked about race, that is not racism. Crystal, do you want to try and come in yet? I know you've been trying to. I haven't had a chance to get you. Crystal wants to know how it ties in with economics. Well, imperialism, as we read in the last chapters, has a deep connection with economics insofar as it began with surplus capital and the need for new markets and surplus laborers. And so there's an economic origin to, or at least one kind of economic origin to the basic imperialist impulse. But the question of race for Arendt, unless someone is going to add, is not as closely tied to economics. It's tied to the idea of superiority and inferiority, and thus to the justification of rule, and even brutal and administrative rule. Does anyone want to add to that?
Roger?
Yes. Hi, Howard. Sam?
Okay.
Howard,
I
and then
was just, Howard can go first. I was going to add something to what you said.
Go for it, Howard.
Am I going? You going?
Howard, go, please. Howard, you can go.
Okay. I was confused as to who had the mic. In listening to this, Roger, I'm impressed by your argument about tension. And I'm beginning to see Arendt as illustrating in several different ways the existence of social, economic, political tension between human beings, human communities, however you want to phrase it. And I'm beginning to see that when she's talking about imperialism and bureaucracy, what she's really pointing to is the resolution of these tensions and how the resolution of these tensions end up with an ideology, okay, which then eventually leads to totalitarianism. So I don't know if I'm seeing it right, but that's where my mind has been going.
I think you're seeing it correctly, but Sam, do you want to jump in and then we'll respond to both of you?
Sure. I was just going to draw our attention to two passages in the chapter that we're looking on in terms of the relationship between economics and racism. I agree with everything you said, Roger, and I just wanted to point out a passage where Arendt is talking about slave labor and the Boers. And she says it was this absolute dependence on the work of others and complete contempt for labor and productivity in any form that transformed the Dutchman into the Boer and gave his concept of race a distinctly economic meaning. Right. So I think she is, and there's a footnote there, and I think she's pointing to that relationship between the contempt for labor and the need and slave labor, and how race becomes inherently tied up with economics. And then on the next page, I just wanted to point out a short sentence where she says racism as a ruling device was used in the society of whites and blacks before imperialism exploited it as a major political idea. And that seems, I think, to kind of underpin and build on what Ian was describing in the chicken egg movement there, to draw it back to the text.
No, those are all good points. I think that it might be helpful at this point, unless there's Sam, do you want to say what page you were reading on? There's a question about that.
So I'm on page 254 in this volume. Question. So I'm sorry about that. It is about, I think it's about 7 pages into the Phantom World of the Dark Continent.
We'll find it. But in any case, okay. the general, I think the general point is, I hope, clear that race, which is a concept that is all over Europe, people talking about it, and is being used for lots of different ways. Some enlightened and some not, and is being used to make distinctions and within prejudicial ways by people, certainly like Gobineau and others, begins to be used to justify brutal oppression. And that is what Arendt is calling racism. And this idea of racism, which the Boers invented, by the way, I mean, around the same time, she doesn't make this argument explicit, although she says it once or twice. And I keep telling my students I'd like one of them to write a senior thesis on this at some point. She says that the American slaveholders did not use racism to justify slavery until the late 19th century. And in a lot of, in a number of histories of racism that I've now read, that same claim is repeated. I don't know enough to fully understand the impact of it, but the claim that others make and that she makes is that when you read what the slaveholders wrote in the 17th and early and 18th and early 19th centuries, they didn't justify what they were doing on terms of white superiority over black. That only began later, and she says around the late 19th century, that it was they used religion to justify it, and they said it was a temporary need. But once it became something that was clearly going to be permanent and administrative, and thus imperialistic in one sense, or totalitarian potentially in another sense, it needed a full-throttled justification, and that's what racism became. And so it would be, I think, fascinating to do a history or to look at the differing rationalizations of slavery in the United States as a project, and in a sense test this hypothesis of Arendt's in a way that I don't think it's fully been tested. In any case, the argument is that race and racism became what she calls a weapon for domination and exploitation. This is what she says on page 206 of our text. Since the race principle supplanted the older notion of alien and strange peoples in Asia, it was a much more consciously applied weapon for domination and exploitation than in Africa. So in Africa, it was more about rule, right? I think Sam or Ian was just saying about rule of peoples, but you took this principle and you exported it to Asia, well, also to Africa and Egypt, and in Asia and India and other places, and it became a weapon for domination, which is how she describes all ideologies at other points in this book. Ideologies are political weapons. And it's important for us to remember that she talks about at least two dominant ideologies of the 20th century. One is racism, which is the ideology that one race is superior to the other in the contest of races. And the other is Marxism, which is the ideology that the proletariat should rule and take over the means of production, and that history, and in both cases, there's a scientific basis for this, that in Marxism, that history will develop towards the rule of the proletariat, and in racism, the idea that the chosen race will win out. She has a fascinating and oft repeated criticism of Darwinism, which I should point out is not a criticism of Darwin. I just want to be very clear about that. She's not at all contesting the idea of of man being scientifically descended from animals and apes, but she does think that Darwinism, which adds to that the idea of the survival of the fittest, which is not a scientific or biological claim, but a moral claim, if you think of fittest as the best, is very dangerous and is used by racists to justify their racism and their feeling of that whoever wins in the war of races is the best and fittest and thus the highest race. And so she recurs in this book a number of times, returns to this critique of Darwinism as opposed to Darwin. And so in this last section on race and bureaucracy is where bureaucracy really comes in this section on the imperialist character. To me, it's one of the most fascinating sections of the whole book, and well worth our time. I spent a fair bit of time on it in the video, so some of you may already have some questions. But the basic point is that whereas race was discovered in Africa, bureaucracy was discovered in Algeria, Egypt, and India, largely through the English colonial rule. And what it was about, bureaucracy, was the attempt to rule foreign peoples through administration, and that the way they could do that was to see these people as their inferiors and in need of their special protection. And so the bureaucrat becomes this, in a sense, savior figure who's going to take care of the native peoples in Algeria, Egypt, and India, and do so out of a sense of altruism and out of the goodness of their heart, which Arendt calls a responsibility that no man can bear for his fellow man, and no people for another people. Are there comments or questions about the bureaucracy part of her argument, which again I talked a lot about in the video, so I don't know how many of you had a chance to watch it.
Yes, this is a little off the topic, but when we think of bureaucracy today, or at least when I do, because I'm in business, tend to think of all the regulation that we're subject to, and I can see where to some extent it has something in common with what Arendt is talking about, but to some extent maybe it's off the mark. I don't know if anybody else is subject to the kind of stringent nitpicking regulation that we in banking are, but wondering if there are any opinions on that.
Yeah, so a bureaucrat here that is that is somewhat unique, although I think it fits with our general common sense in many ways. The key distinction that she makes is that the bureaucrat does not follow laws. They're not subject to laws. The bureaucrat, and anyone who's like you, Bob, who's dealt with a bureaucrat, has experienced this. You walk up to a bureaucrat at a teller or at a DMV or whatever, and that bureaucrat has all the power in the world. They can serve you well or not serve you well, and it's somewhat at their discretion. There's this incredible power that a bureaucrat has, and in a sense, what they give up for that power is fame or recognition in the world. But what they get is this ability to, even though they're just one cog in the system, to make your life hell if they want. You say regulations. Yeah, the bureaucrats issue regulations, which are different from laws because they are not, they're not passed by a particular, usually a legislative body. They're passed by bureaucrats who are often anonymous, and these regulations regulate how the bureaucrats act. But the bureaucrats have usually discretion on how to apply them, who to apply them to. You don't go before a judge and ask to have the law applied. You go before a bureaucrat, and the bureaucrat can negotiate these regulations. The bureaucrat can be very literal and say, I'm not going to, undot the I or uncross the T, but the bureaucrat can also do that, uncross the T and undot the I. And it's this power of the bureaucrat is one of the core aspects of bureaucracy that Arendt identifies. Another, right, and going along with it, is that these bureaucrats who have a kind of secrecy, they don't have to tell you what. I can come up to the window and the bureaucrat can decide to give me money even though I don't have exactly the right document. and Bob can come up to the window and the bureaucrat can not give him the money and he also doesn't have exactly the right document, and they don't have to explain themselves. And this secrecy is part of the power and in a sense joy of the bureaucrat for Arendt. They are the expert behind the scenes, who, she says, pulls the strings of history above all law. And that's what makes them powerful, but also, in her mind, incredibly dangerous, especially when you combine this idea of bureaucracy with an idea of racism, so that the bureaucrat can simply decide, look, there's a lot of poor people who are Muslim over here, or Jewish over here, or black over there, and if we just got rid of these people, things would go better. And so, since there's no one looking over me, a little bit of an administrative massacre wouldn't be a bad idea. And she's constantly alert to the fact that this is how the bureaucrats in Egypt, Algeria, and India thought. That they just desperately wanted to be left alone by their superiors in England to run the thing in a way that would work. And it's this sort of anonymous bureaucracy. You can't really complain to them, because who are the bureaucrats? They're these secret people who work in the dark, that she saw as absolutely essential for this. Ian's right. It's not early imperialism, but the imperialist rule that went along with the suppression of peoples.
Well, I think the picture you paint is maybe more characteristic of the bureaucrats that Arendt is talking about. In this country, they're far more constrained and maybe less arbitrary, and there's always this tension between administering the law to the ultimate degree, or administering the regulation to the ultimate degree, or bringing judgment to bear. And of course, we want those with authority over us to have judgment, yet on the other hand, when the judgment goes against us, we don't like it. So, but I think I'll back off, because maybe this is not what others would like to talk about.
Well, I actually don't want to back off, Bob, because I think it's exactly where the interesting push and shove comes, right? You're right. In this country, we pride ourselves on having a bureaucracy that is restrained, and that's an achievement, right? And England did too. What she found fascinating, on the one hand, about imperialism is that because of the distance between the law in England and the colonial bureaucrats in Africa and India, that the true nature of bureaucracy was brought out. And what she's, in a sense, saying is that bureaucracy is constrained and doesn't reach its true nature when, in England or in the United States or in a place where extreme and unjust actions by the bureaucrats could lead to complaints and a sense of injustice. But when you free the bureaucrats from those constraints and you put them in a place where, far away, where the natives can't complain, and where there's in fact a sense of justification, like just shut them up, the true nature of the bureaucrat comes out. I think that's important both for understanding imperialism and her claim here, but also for understanding the danger of bureaucracy that she sees in this country and in the Western world as well. She calls bureaucracy the rule of nobody. And one of the dangers of bureaucracy is that when the bureaucrats act and deprive and make a decision that is unjust, you don't know who to complain to. You don't know who to argue to. It's like this anonymous bureaucracy that is acting. And she worries that as the bureaucracy in Western countries becomes larger and more powerful, the idea of responsibility, of democratic participation, of democratic self-rule, the idea that government is actually a responsible and legitimate actor is threatened. And it's one of the reasons she begins to worry that the great threat to American freedom is bureaucracy. Now, Ian may come in here and say, this is again Roger doing a dangerous thing, reading her later work back into Origins. And let me say, okay, I actually think of it the other way. I think that it's often, you can actually understand her later work much better if you understand her early work in Origins. And I think in a sense here, what we see is her articulation of deep ideas about bureaucracy that will inform her suspicion of bureaucracy in some of her later work. And so while Bob is right that, you know, generally bureaucrats today are more restrained, the overarching power of bureaucracy, that so many of the laws and the regulations Bob is talking about that affect him as a business person are written not by legislators, but by regulators and bureaucrats. And that in order to respond to them, you have to figure out which bureaucracy and 5 different bureaucracies and who to talk to. And in fact, you often can't even figure it out. That's part of the system. It's a kind of disincentive for legal political engagement. I mean, there's a great story that Philip Howard tells at the beginning of his book, The Rule of Nobody, about a flood that happened in a town. And after the flood, a tree fell through the river, across the river, and it was causing more flooding. And the town decided to remove the tree from the river to stop the flooding. And as they were about to do so, the Environmental Protection Agency came and said, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to take anything out of this river. It's a protected river. Well, okay, they said, well, it's flooding. Who do we go to? And it took 6 months and 4 different agencies to try and untangle who could give them permission to remove this tree from the river to prevent the flood. Okay, it's an extreme example, but it's an example of the way bureaucracy can simply deaden our sense of empowerment and political engagement in a world, because there's no legislator, there's no person in power, and it thus empowers the bureaucrats to be the people who can make these decisions behind the scenes. And that, I think, is a powerful idea of bureaucracy that she develops looking at Egypt and India, that I do think is important for us to think about as we try and understand the more benign bureaucracy Bob's describing, regulating our small businesses and banks and others.
Maybe some of the Europeans on the line can weigh in on the reaction against, it seems from the American perspective, against the Brussels bureaucrats. Maybe they're more powerful, more bureaucratic than what we in the U.S. are used to.
That's for sure.
Okay.
2 things come to my mind, Roger. One thing is that bureaucracy is part of the legislative scheme, that the people empowered to make the laws acknowledge their inability to deal with specific instances in a particular context, and so give this broad authority to someone else. And then the second, so that raises the whole question of democracy and the control of governance, in my mind, anyway. And
yeah, there's a famous book written about 30 or 40 years ago about just that issue, Howard, about the way that the American Congress, the legislature, has increasingly legislated less specifically, and thus granting more and more of the actual rule of government to administrative agencies and bureaucracies for a number of reasons. But one is because that way the legislators are actually excused from actually having to make the hard judgments about what to do, and thus protected in their election and their attempts for re-election, but also because of this increasing belief in the power of experts and bureaucracies to run things better than democracies. And I think this, we've avoided contemporary politics now for a little bit in this conversation, but here it comes, right? I mean, there's a real in the idea of bureaucracy is a faith in elite experts to run things in a way that is better than the way that democratically elected and democratically motivated legislatures would do. I want to come back to Crystal, who had a question about bureaucracy. She wrote, "Are you there, Crystal, or should I read it?" She says that she was drawing correlation between corporations who don't take responsibility for their behavior, and their mandate is to make money. You want to add to that, Crystal, or not?
Her mic isn't working, Roger.
Her mic's not working. Okay. Let's go on to Joyce. My understanding is that bureaucracy works by creating a situation in which no one is ultimately responsible, which is different from not taking responsibility. It is systemic. Okay, no one is responsible, but that means that the bureaucrat can always say it's not my fault. That's just what I'm, that's just my job. That's just what I'm supposed to do. On the one hand, right? On the other hand, bureaucracy is a taking responsibility that no one should bear, which is to say, I'm in charge, and I'm going to decide how we should deal with this population, and we're not going to let democracies decide. I think one of the worries that a lot of people have about bureaucracies right now is that, whether it's in the European Union or in the United States or elsewhere, is that increasingly we have, as for very particular reasons, and the book I was talking about before is this book by Ted Lowy, we have increasingly decided to absent ourselves from having to make the hard decisions about governing and given it over to experts, A, because we value the experts, but B, because we don't want to take that responsibility of deciding who should get the life-saving operation or not. Should we decide that as voters who elect congressmen who make that decision? Or should we let unnamed bureaucrats decide who's going to get the extra heart transplant and who's not? And that's the kind of responsibility that they take that no man should bear. Or maybe they should bear, but when you decide to eliminate some people in order to make life better for the rest, that's a responsibility no man should bear. Robert, you want to ask your question? How does this fit with arbitrary power?
Yeah, I mean, in some of the ways that you're talking about, the bureaucrat can stamp the form or not stamp the form, and that's the purview of the bureaucrat, and that's actually, what we in some way find to be arbitrary power, because the regulations are how things are done, but the bureaucrat holds the power. And so that power to do or not do. I mean, I understand why regulations are the mode of governance for things that are not colonies or provinces or anything like that, because you don't want, individuals, I mean, you don't want or you're not willing to make individuals either subjects or citizens. And so you need some sort of organizing principle that's not legal, because this is kind of not a legal domain. But I'm confused with with the kind of arbitrariness of bureaucratic power. How does that fit with what seems to be an originally sort of crusader-like or altruistic mission that ends up in these places to begin with, and she refers to as the dragon slayer mentality. We're going to go and set things right and then manage that. Is it with this moment with Lord Cromer in Egypt, where he has no idea why he's there, but he is? And was bureaucracy initially something that had a purpose and an aim that then lost it and became an empty kind of form of power? That's kind of what I'm asking about.
Yeah, I think the bureaucrats sees themselves as a hero, as the dragon slayer. I mean, Lord Cromer sees himself as someone whose job it is to civilize the Egyptians. And he's willing to sacrifice so much to do so, right? If he had stayed in England, he might have been famous. He might have had, he might have gotten recognition for what he had done. He might have made a lot of money. Instead, he takes on this job of, thankless job of using violence to subdue the natives, and all he gets from England is grief. How could you be so violent? How could you do such things? We're going to reprimand you. And yet his job is, of course, to subdue. And so what she says is that a lot of the people who go into government and are the bank regulators that Bob is dealing with are well-meaning, idealistic people who actually believe, right, that that they are doing something good. And I'm not trying, I'm pushing this comparison because I think it's informative, and I think, and if it doesn't work, then Bob is right. Then we're talking about apples and oranges, two different kinds of bureaucracies. So I'm trying to see if they work. And Scott Goldstein is a question coming up, right? Which is that in the voting rights in the South, the law said everyone can vote, but you had these bureaucrats throughout the South that had the power to deny the right to vote to people, and other rights too. And that kind of power that a bureaucrat has, makes the bureaucrat this heroic figure in some ways. There's just an article that came out this week, I think it was in the Times, about this sheriff, I think down in the South. I forget what city's in a small little town. His family had been there for a long time. He'd gone away. He came back on the idea of cleaning up this town, and he ran for sheriff, and he just instituted this incredibly racist police department where they were arresting and beating up blacks in the town for years. And finally, he's being brought to task, although I'm not even sure if he's actually being arrested. But a number of people in his department have been. But what's amazing in reading this is how this guy saw himself as a kind of hero, as someone who was brought in to clean up the town and keep things working. And he really saw himself as a dragon slayer in this sense. And yet, for the black population of this town, he was an incredibly dangerous person. And that's the danger of bureaucracy, right? It seems to work well. You create this idea of well-meaning people who want to regulate things. They're experts. They know what they're talking about, and they can run things better than legislators, and God forbid, better than us voters who don't know anything about banking regulation or voting rights, right? But you give these people such power that it can be abused greatly. Not all bureaucracy is bad, right? But it can be abused. And what we see in this book is the way that imperialism as a political mode of suppressing and oppressing other peoples, and thus not a nationalist form of government, but an imperialist form of government, needs, in the end, not at the beginning, but needs racism and needs bureaucracy. And it's a fairly original reading of imperialism that she offers here. Scott, do you want to add anything, Scott Goldstein, or was that helpful?
That was helpful. I didn't want to chime in too much. This is my first meeting with the group, so I'm still catching up.
Good. Well, welcome. Jack Hirschfeld, you want to add
yes,
something?
Yeah, I'd like to bring the discussion to the present for a moment.
Okay.
So the combination of racism and bureaucracy that imperialism depends on, and that allows for the continuous expansion that imperialism is, and imperialism, remember, arises out of a surplus of capital and surplus of labor. I believe that we are currently in that situation, and that what is sometimes thought of as this new movement of American nationalism is really imperialism, with the target people are obviously the Muslims. And so I'd like to read it's not a paragraph, three or four sentences where she talks about Cecil Rhodes, which, in my opinion, describes Steve Bannon. So, do I have your permission to do that?
Yeah. What page are you on, Jack?
I'm on page, in my edition, I'm on page 215.
All right.
Page 215, in which she's talking about Rhodes's monstrous innate vanity, right? And she says that the desire for glory can no longer be satisfied by the glorious triumph over a specific people for the sake of one's own people, nor can the sense of duty be fulfilled through the consciousness of specific services and the fulfillment of specific tasks. No matter what individual qualities or defects a man may have, once he has entered the maelstrom of an unending process of expansion, he will, as it were, cease to be what he was and obey the laws of the process, identify himself with anonymous forces that he is supposed to serve in order to keep the whole process in motion. He will think of himself as mere function and eventually consider such functionality, such an incarnation of the dynamic trend, his highest possible achievement. Then, as Rhodes was insane enough to say, he could indeed do nothing wrong. What he did became right. It was his duty to do what he wanted. He felt himself a god, nothing less.
Yeah. I think those are great sentences. And I think they're relevant, but I'm not sure how to Steve Bannon. I don't know if you want to say something about it.
Yeah, Steve Bannon. There's been some material that's finally made it into the news, but if you've been following Steve Bannon, you know about his talk to the Vatican in 2014.
Yeah,
and the position that he appears to be taking, that there is a stage in history that we're at, a destiny that his position a destiny that we are fulfilling, that is that involves the complete destruction of the current system, which begins to sound like the footprint of totalitarianism, right? And he seems to think that he's at the core of it.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about with Bannon is super interesting, and I think he does have, it's clear he has a kind of he's accepted an argument that we are in a contest of civilizations, a clash of civilizations, and he thinks our civilization has become weak because of a combination of what he calls crony capitalism and secularism, and that he thinks that we are losing to the Muslim, radical Muslims, and that we need to fight them on their terms. I think it's very, it's fascinating and scary, Bannon's view of the world. But I don't think he's a bureaucrat in this sense, or even a secret agent, as Arendt's talking about it. The idea of someone like Rhodes, right, is that, and like Cromer, is that they became advocates, they became actors for what they did, simply because they saw it as their role, right? Cromer came to identify as a bureaucrat. He wrote a book about the philosophy of the bureaucrat. And the point is, he was supposed to keep order in Egypt no matter what. And what she's saying is, he didn't have like a moral or purpose driving him. He didn't have a sense of why he was doing it, except that it was his lot in life that he had embraced as a dragon slayer to be the bureaucrat who does this. Rhodes, again, thought the world was about expansion, and his great role in life was to continue the expansion of England and of the economy, and give his life over to this idea larger than himself. Similarly, Lawrence of Arabia, to come to the end of the book, is someone who abandoned any sense of why he was fighting. He came to not think that Arab nationalism was a good thing in itself, nor did he think English imperialism was a good in itself. What he came to see is that the world is full and run by forces, that some will win and some will lose, and that all you can do as a little cog is not be a cog by paddling in the direction of the forces. And what he had succeeded in doing was picking the right forces and paddling along and getting drawn along. And so what she's talking about here is that the imperialist idea, which is, again, let's go back to the basics of imperialism. It's bringing an economic idea of infinite expansion, the idea that you can keep growing an economy without limit, into a political sphere where it doesn't fit, because politics is about moral, physical, and legitimating limits, and putting economics in a place where it doesn't belong. What you have with imperialism is that it's carried along by people, bureaucrats here in this case, who don't actually think about why they're doing what they're doing. They don't think about the larger questions. They simply embrace their role mentality, their role idea, and they're going to do the best job they can at it, even if it means, doing horrendous and awful things. And that's why, for her, the bureaucrat, the imperialist, the secret agent, the worker, the Eichmann, are deeply connected to this modern this modern imperialist, monstrous way of life, one in which we submit to forces of growth and direction, that we give up the moral and human potential to control. That is sort of what she's stretching here to say in these final pages of the chapter, that this is part of the rise of a kind of nihilism, where we simply don't think there's any highest values left, and we will go along with any value that wins. And it's part of this idea of imperialism as a thought of infinite expansion without limits. And it's these kind of automatic processes that she is here exploring and expressing her revulsion at.
Well, I have to say my comment is not really about what Arendt is talking about, bearing in mind that she writes these words at a time when the empires still existed, when the totalitarian states had just been defeated. Actually, in her time, the Soviet state still existed, right? So, so it's a little different than the situation that we find ourselves in today. This is prior to the wind that swept Africa that she writes this. And so it's I'm trying to look at her understanding, or rather her interpretation of how totalitarianism came into existence in her time. I'm trying to think through what it might look like in this post-colonial world that we live in.
Yeah, well,
where the economic factors are the same. The economic factors haven't changed. So imperialism takes a different shape. And I'm not exactly sure that we fully understand how that happens, or what it looks like, or where it will go. But my sense, the thing that I was trying to express is, my sense is that the current movement in the US points to a direction that is similar to the direction that she saw imperialism taking the world. So,
okay.
And that's really all that I'm saying.
All right. There are a couple questions I haven't gotten to yet. Does anyone want to put their question out there? David, Joyce, or Paul, or Sam, or John, Bevan? Any of you guys want to jump in? Joyce, you want to? Joyce says, if the current U.S. administration is undermining bureaucracy, what does that mean for a critique of bureaucracy as a tool of disempowerment? Well, first of all, let's wait and see if they undermine bureaucracy. They've claimed they're going to, and we'll see. I don't think they have a deep philosophical understanding of it. That said, both in Europe and in the United States, part of the feeling of disempowerment that you're talking about and disenfranchisement comes from the fact that I think people feel that they are increasingly confronted by governmental power that they don't understand and that they can't control. There's no doubt there's a lot of different reasons that these populist leaders are winning in Europe and the United States, but one of them is that, and I think to not credit that is a mistake. You're asking, what does this mean for our critique of bureaucracy as a tool of disempowerment? I think it means that there's a deep desire for people to have more power and control over their lives, especially in countries that claim to be democratic, and that may mean reducing the bureaucracy. It's a very hard thing to do. I have very little confidence that they'll be able to do it, but it would be interesting if they were successful in some way. And then what you ask what it would mean that we would suddenly be put in a position of having to make democratic electoral choices about issues that we've let bureaucrats handle for the last 50 to 100 years. And that would cause real political debate and more dissension than we even have now, maybe, which I think would be a good thing, personally. But you don't have to agree with me on that. Joyce, do you want to add to that? Paul, you want to ask your question, Paul? Paul writes that bureaucracy slows the application of policy made at a higher level, for better or worse. There's an apocryphal story about Italian bureaucrats in World War II stopping the deportation of Jews by telling the Nazi authorities they did not have the right forms and approvals. Yeah, bureaucracy, look, a lot of bureaucracy can be done for good. It can also slow things, but at times it can also speed things up. The bureaucrats can simply make decisions and not go to ask the legislature, because the legislature slows things down. I mean, one of the advantages of bureaucracy is that it speeds up decision making that is too slow in a democracy. That's one of the classic justifications for bureaucracy. And yes, now the left wants the bureaucracy back, as Joyce says. All right, it's 2:30. Are there any burning final questions that people want to ask, or should we end and move on? So let me say that we're going to take a break next week. The next chapter is a long chapter on continental imperialism. And so I've decided to give you guys 2 weeks to read it. Also, we've been reading a lot. It's for those of us who've been doing this every week, thought it would be good to give us a week off. So it's an important chapter on, and here's, in a sense, where this chapter on imperialism really begins to enter into the totalitarian era, and you begin to see the beginnings of racially based totalitarian thinking in Europe. And that's, I think, going to be very interesting for many of you and for us. So I look forward to talking to you about it in 2 Fridays, in 2 weeks. I hope you keep enjoying reading Arendt. We'll keep the room open in case people want to talk for a little bit to each other. And I look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks all very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.